Thank you. I should unmute at the very beginning. Welcome everybody to the City of Minneapolis public meeting about the Land Use Rezoning Study. My name is Jason Wittenberg. I'm a planning manager for the City of Minneapolis. Before I have everyone introduce themselves, I'll say a little bit about this meeting. Our intent is to present for roughly 45 minutes and then use the remainder of the time to respond to questions. All questions that come to us during the meeting must be submitted in writing using the Q&A function in Teams. We're going to attempt to respond to some of the questions in writing during the meeting. And then after the presentation, we'll also have one of our staff read some of the questions for us to respond to verbally. It's quite possible that we won't get to all of the questions, and perhaps some of the questions might take a little bit of research. So our intent also, as soon as practical, is to publish responses online to all of the questions that we received tonight. I'll go over the timeline in the next slide, but I just want to note right away that the city has extended the public review period an additional 30 days from the initial 45-day review period. I'll also note that we're recording this event, and it's our intent to post it on the city's YouTube channel so that people who aren't able to attend tonight also have an opportunity to watch it on their own time. Or if perhaps you're not able to stick around for the whole event, you'll also be able to follow up and watch it on YouTube. We will also post the slides from tonight's presentation online. And I'd just like to thank Shanna Sether and Madel Muta, our two staff people who are working behind the scenes tonight to make this go as smoothly as possible. With that, I'll let the other presenters introduce themselves.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Joe Bernard. I'm a planning project manager here in CPED at the City of Minneapolis.
Hello, I'm Janelle Woodmeyer. I am a principal city planner, also in CPED with the city.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Andrew Friends. I am also a principal planner with CPED.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Let's go through the agenda for the meeting. We'll cover background material that will provide some context regarding what has happened up to this point. We'll explain what the Land Use Rezoning Study is. We'll cover the structure of new zoning standards and how to navigate the project website and submit feedback. We'll provide a summary of the content of proposed changes, and finally, we'll provide answers to questions. As I noted, we'll attempt to respond to some of those questions during the meeting, respond verbally to others, and provide written responses online as soon as we're able. Next slide, please. The city, along with other cities in the metro area, is required to update its comprehensive plan every 10 years. We are also required by statute to eliminate conflicts between our comprehensive plan and our zoning code, and we're required to do so relatively quickly. So, for example, if the comprehensive plan has a map that indicates that a particular property should accommodate commercial uses, but our zoning code and zoning map only allows residential uses on that property, we have to fix that to align with what the plan calls for. Our comprehensive plan, Minneapolis 2040, was adopted in 2019. It took effect at the beginning of 2020. The zoning code is one of the primary tools to implement the comprehensive plan, and the city has been incrementally updating its zoning code to align with the plan. Here's a list of some of what has been accomplished so far. The same day that Minneapolis 2040 took effect, an inclusionary zoning ordinance also took effect that requires affordable units, affordable housing units in new multifamily housing development. Duplexes and triplexes were legalized in the city's lowest density zoning districts. And then the first of two major rezoning studies took effect at the beginning of 2021. The Built Form Rezoning Study followed guidance from Built Form policies and the Built Form map in the comprehensive plan and determined the allowed scale of buildings through regulations that pertain to things like building height, allowed floor area, setbacks, lot coverage, and impervious surfaces. And it did that through built form overlay districts that are applied to all properties throughout the city. Zoning code change in dealing with parking and travel demand management took effect in 2021. Since that time, we've been laying the groundwork for the Land Use Rezoning Study, and that has included 5 meetings with the City Planning Commission to date at their Committee of the Whole meetings. A draft of the ordinance was posted online on the project website on January 12th, which kicked off a 45-day review period. We have responded to requests from some in the public to provide more time again to review and comment on the draft materials. So we've extended the public review period an additional 30 days. That ends on March 26th. The intent is to enter the city's formal review process shortly after that. The City Planning Commission is the opportunity to provide public testimony at a public hearing on April 24th, and you can also submit materials for the Planning Commission's consideration as well. It's expected that the Planning Commission will make a recommendation to the City Council at that time after considering the staff recommendation and public input. The Planning Commission's recommendation would then proceed through the City Council process with final adoption scheduled for May 25th and publication on June 5th. That's the earliest then that the ordinance would take effect based on this timeline. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Joe for the next slide.
Thanks, Jason. As Jason covered in our timeline overview, the Land Use Rezoning Study is the next step in bringing our zoning regulations into alignment with Minneapolis 2040. Minneapolis 2040 guides development through 2 main lenses: built form and land use. And if you hear us repeating some things over some of these slides, stick with us because we really want to hammer home what is covered in this project versus what has been covered elsewhere. So every property in the city was given a designation from each of these 2 lenses when Minneapolis 2040 was adopted. Built form addresses things like height, setbacks, floor area ratio, all of the things that control how big a building can be. Changes to the zoning ordinance addressing built form have already been adopted and are already in place, and it's not the focus of this project. So what land use addresses is basically what are the activities, uses that can go into those buildings, meaning residential, commercial, etc. So as a quick example, as it stands today, some industrial uses are allowed in our current industrial zoning districts that Minneapolis 2040 says we should no longer allow. The Land Use Rezoning Study addresses this inconsistency by changing the zoning ordinance in this example to prohibit those industrial uses. As Jason mentioned, this need for alignment between zoning and adopted city plans is something that is in fact required by state law. Next slide, please. This slide, we just want to remind everyone that the policies in Minneapolis 2040, which this work is based on, included a very extensive public engagement effort. So over 150 meetings, 20,000 points of feedback that informed the direction of the plan now guides the work in this rezoning study. So 14 goals guided the creation of the plan, and we continue to look at those goals as a means to evaluate this work. All of this public feedback and information about the engagement process from Minneapolis 2040 can be viewed online at the link on this slide. You can see here an example of a public comment from the plan that resulted in, again, some policy direction about polluting industries in the city. Next slide, please. So as we're making recommendations about the zoning code, we're asking ourselves some key questions. Does this change to the code advance the goals of the plan? Are we fulfilling our obligation to state law about consistency between our plans and regulations? Are we making the code easier to use? And what are the potential unintended consequences of this work? Along with the draft zoning code text on the website, we've published a draft racial equity impact assessment. It's something that we do with all ordinance changes at the city. We'd encourage folks to review and comment on that in addition to the substantive code text changes that we will cover tonight. Next slide, please. Zoning codes are legal documents, and they tend to not be very exciting to read. While we think proposed changes make it easier to navigate the code, we tried to offer a number of different ways you can review and digest this content on the project website. In addition to the code text itself, you can find summaries of key issues by land use topic, essentially zoning code district groups, and by individual chapters. As you click on this content in what we call these carousels on the website, you'll get a little drop down that gives you more information about the topic and an opportunity to dive further into that information if you're interested. There's also a handout available in PDF form that attempts to put all of the key issues in one place that we think could be very useful. That handout includes the draft zoning map and the draft use table, which I'll let Jason explain a little more on the next slide. Finally, there is an interactive map that allows you to explore all of the proposed zoning district boundaries. And if you're interested in a specific property, there should be an address search there that is pretty useful. So next slide, I will hand it over to Jason to cover the use table.
Thank you, Joe. We're proposing a single table that lists the permitted and conditional uses in all zoning districts. Right now, one has to go back and forth between different chapters within the zoning code to get the full picture of which uses are allowed in which zoning districts. The colors in this use table are correlated with the districts on the map. And we'll go into more detail about the use table later in the presentation as well. Next slide. When reviewing the draft zoning map, again, the colors align with the colors on the use table. Most future land use categories that are listed in the comprehensive plan have a zoning district that perfectly aligns with the future land use in the plan. We have staff who are reviewing to make sure there are no errors and misalignments between the zoning map and the future land use map. We'd appreciate also if you spot anything that appears to be errors, please feel free to let us know that. You can scroll around the draft map or use a search function by address in the upper right-hand corner of the map. Next slide, please. I think there was perhaps a question in the Q&A about how to submit feedback. And this slide covers that. There are multiple ways to submit feedback on the project website. There's a survey. You can send us an email. That email is listed on the website. There's a comment form. And I'll note also you can sign up to receive email updates about the project. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Janelle.
Thank you, Jason. We are now going to move into the part of the presentation summarizing the proposed changes in the zoning code. As previously mentioned, the purpose of this rezoning study is to make sure our land use regulations are consistent with the policies of Minneapolis 2040, and a future land use designation is applied to each property in the city. Therefore, with each new zoning district, we had to consider the future land use guidance from the comprehensive plan. In most cases, the future land use guidance translates into one new zoning district. However, sometimes there are other related policies and action steps that allow for distinctions in how properties are zoned with a specific land use designation. And just as we needed to consider policy guidance in determining new primary zoning districts, the draft use regulations consider the policy guidance as well. In some cases, the policy guidance is very clear for what uses can or cannot be allowed. However, in most cases, the policy guidance is very general and the draft code is providing the details for how the general policy guidance or language, should be implemented. Next slide, please. So we're going to start with the proposed urban neighborhood districts. These districts are implementing the urban neighborhood future land use guidance. Of all the future land use designations, the urban neighborhood designation covers the most properties in the city. The guidance states that urban neighborhood is intended to be predominantly residential. It also includes small-scale institutional and semi-public uses such as schools, community centers, and religious institutions, but it does not generally support new commercial business development. There's an exception to this that I will explain later on related to another zoning district. Next slide, please. Since these areas with urban neighborhood designations are guided to be primarily residential, other policies and action steps that were considered were mostly focused on increasing access to housing. These include general action steps that apply to all parts of the city, as well as more specific guidance for how to increase housing access for different parts of the city that include in and near downtown, along transit routes, neighborhoods that already have a mix of housing types, and neighborhoods farthest from downtown. Looking at these action steps, there are indications that more than one urban neighborhood district is needed, and that raised a question, how many districts are needed? Next slide, please. Since the urban neighborhood designation covers so many properties, we also took into consideration built form guidance. The properties that have urban neighborhood future land use guidance also have separate built form guidance that identifies the scale of development that is appropriate. That built form guidance ranges from Interior 1, which is a designation that calls for development to be small scale, to Transit 30, which is a designation that calls for large-scale development. So again, keep in mind that the built form regulations, which include things like maximum height and maximum floor area, that ultimately determine how big a building envelope can be, were previously adopted and are in place right now. Those regulations are in an overlay district and not in the primary zoning district regulations. But the guidance for a couple of the built form designations also includes some land use direction. Specifically, the Interior 1 guidance states individual lots are permitted to have up to 3 dwelling units. And then in the Interior 2 guidance, that states that multifamily buildings with more than 3 units are permitted on larger lots. The built form regulations don't determine what uses are allowed. That, again, is the purpose of the primary zoning district. So with all this comprehensive plan guidance to consider for properties with the urban neighborhood guidance, there were two main questions that needed to be answered. How many urban neighborhood districts are needed, and then what institutional and civic uses should be allowed in those districts. Next slide, please. So the draft proposes 3 urban neighborhood districts, and the following is just a very, very brief summary of each of those districts, and of course, doesn't reflect all the uses that would be allowed in those districts. Starting with the first district, which is UN1. This is applied where there is Interior 1 built form guidance. It's shown as the lightest orange shade on the map. And of the 3 urban neighborhood districts, UN1 is the most restrictive when it comes to the types of residential and institutional and civic uses allowed. This district allows up to 3 dwelling units to be established on each property, so that it's consistent with the guidance of this specific combination of the urban neighborhood land use feature and the Interior 1 built form guidance. Then there's the UN2 district, which is applied where there is Interior 2 and Interior 3 built form guidance. This is shown as the medium orange shade on the map. In addition to uses that are allowed in UN1, the UN2 district would also permit dwellings with 4 or more units if those regulations of the applicable built form overlay district could be met. And then the third district is UN3. This is applied to areas that have any other built form designation that also has a combination of urban neighborhood. And that's shown as the darkest orange shade on the map. Of the urban neighborhood districts, UN3 is the most permissive. It allows the most types of residential uses and institutional and civic uses. In addition to the uses that are allowed in UN2, UN3 would also allow some additional types of residential uses, such as fraternities or sororities. Next slide, please. Residential mixed-use districts are the next type of proposed district. They're also a type of residential district, but they are applied to areas where there is policy guidance that supports additional commercial and institutional civic uses that wouldn't be allowed in the urban neighborhood districts. There are three main areas of policy in Minneapolis 2040 that apply to the purpose of the residential mixed-use districts. The first is goods and services corridors. These corridors identify where establishment of commercial uses can be considered outside of commercial districts. There are properties that have an urban neighborhood future land use designation that abut designated goods and services corridors. So this is the exception to the urban neighborhood commercial guidance that I mentioned previously. There's also guidance for the neighborhood office and services future land use designation that calls for allowing some lower impact commercial activity that wouldn't be allowed in the UN district or urban neighborhood district. And as well as some guidance for public office and institutional future land use designations, which is fairly broadly applied. It covers the downtown core, large institutional campuses, and some nearby residential neighborhoods. It includes policy language that supports a mix of uses, but it also indicates that distinctions can be made within this land use designation for how different areas are zoned. Next slide, please. While the comprehensive plan calls for a mechanism to allow commercial activity on goods and services corridors in the urban neighborhood areas and calls for making distinctions between downtown versus other areas where there's the public office and institutional designation, it doesn't provide clear direction for how to accomplish that. So two of the key questions for these land use designations that the residential mixed use districts work to answer are: how do we best encourage residential and small scale retail and services along goods and services corridors where there's urban neighborhood guidance? And considering the diversity of context presence, what is the best way to apply primary districts in the public office and institutional areas? Next slide, please. What's proposed is 3 residential mixed-use districts. The first is RM1, which is applied to goods and services corridors where there is urban neighborhood future land use guidance, and that's shown as light tan on the map. The proposed allowed uses would be similar to the UN3 district, but small-scale commercial uses would be allowed when part of a mixed-use multi-story development that includes a residential use. The reason a residential use is required to be included is to reinforce the intent of the urban neighborhood designation. Then there's the RM2 district, which is applied to properties with the neighborhood office and services designation. It's a little darker tan on the map, but it's maybe a little difficult to see because there's not a lot of properties with that designation. So in addition to the uses allowed in the RM1 district, the RM2 district allows some additional commercial uses. Generally, most of the commercial uses still need to be part of a mixed-use building. And then there's the RM3 district, which is applied to areas downtown where the current zoning is residential or office residential with the public office institutional land use guidance, and then outside of downtown with that anywhere where we have that public office institutional designation. And that's shown as a dark brown on the map. So the allowed uses in RM3 include those that are also allowed in RM2, but also uses that typically have a larger campus, such as a hospital or university. And with that, I will be handing it over to Joe.
Great, so let's cover the commercial mixed-use districts next. As we've developed recommendations for our commercial areas, we've again looked to the guidance in Minneapolis 2040 to give us an idea of how many districts we need, how those districts need to be different from each other, and how we can achieve the stated goals of the plan. Plan guidance directs us to prohibit auto-oriented uses in some districts, for example, to allow varying degrees of intensity and size of individual uses depending on the district, and in some cases to require certain classes of commercial activity on key sites. Next slide, please. To start off, let's highlight the fact that Minneapolis 2040 calls for us to move toward achieving goals like complete communities, climate change resilience, and more residents and jobs. So one way the plan does this is by increasing areas that allow commercial uses by over 50%. More commercial access in more locations means less driving, less pollution, greater neighborhood connectivity, and opportunities to grow our economy and accommodate more residents. On the left map here, you see the extent of zoning that would allow commercial uses along with a quarter-mile buffer, which is about a 5-minute walk. And then on the right, you can see a comparison of the existing extent of zoning that allows commercial uses alongside the proposed expanded extent. Next slide, please. So what does Minneapolis 2040 say about commercial mixed-use districts? There are 4 districts outlined in the plan, each having a slightly different focus. Neighborhood mixed use is intended to allow small-scale commercial uses, and oftentimes this is off of corridors, and as shown on the future land use map. Expansion of these commercial areas is not encouraged in the policy language. For corridor mixed use, this is the most broadly applied district from Minneapolis 2040, commercial district that is. These areas serve larger market areas and are applied mostly to major corridors in the city. So commercial expansion from these areas is allowed, and these sites tend to be able to accommodate larger uses than neighborhood mixed use. Community mixed use is applied in areas that probably already have a reputation for being more pedestrian friendly, often at the intersection of major transit lines. And this is the first designation where standalone residential development is not permitted. So that means that some non-residential aspect must be incorporated into projects in this district to help continue to foster that walkable commercial environment. The final one here is destination mixed use, and this is typically reserved for the few parcels at the very heart of major commercial districts. So think right at the intersection of Penn and Broadway, or Lowry and Central, or Hennepin and Lake. Similar to community mixed use, a commercial component is required of development at these key locations. Next slide, please. There are a number of action steps from Minneapolis 2040 that we have to pay special attention to while developing regulations for commercial districts. I'm not going to go through all of these, but just a sampling here. We're striving to not make existing commercial uses non-conforming in this process, and to in fact bring many non-conforming commercial properties back into conformance with these zoning changes. Said more simply, this means we're going to allow commercial uses where they already exist. As we've discussed, designating additional areas for commercial zoning is a key strategy for increasing access to commercial goods and services. And as Janelle covered, proactively applying that RM1 zoning district on goods and services corridors is a part of this effort, in addition to the increase in commercial mixed-use zoning. Not listed here, but another thing to look for is that Minneapolis 2040 calls for prohibiting auto-focused uses. So think auto repair from the neighborhood, community, and destination mixed-use areas. And also, for example, prohibiting new gas stations citywide. Next slide, please. The result is that we have 4 proposed commercial mixed-use zoning districts, and they correlate on the map 1-to-1 with the future land use map guidance in Minneapolis 2040. So the key differences are as described in the previous slides. CM1 is intended to serve smaller markets and areas and allows for smaller size commercial uses. CM2 allows for a really wide range of commercial scales, while CM3 and CM4 have those requirements for providing a minimum of commercial uses. The details about requiring those commercial uses in CM3 and CM4, you can find those in the draft chapter 530, and I'd encourage folks to take a closer look at that if you're particularly interested in that issue. Next slide, please. As you're looking through the use table, you can find all of the commercial use categories listed here on the use table. With some notable exceptions, most commercial uses are allowed in all of the proposed districts, but the difference being that there are specific standards that some uses need to achieve, and including not exceeding a maximum square footage per use in some districts. And of course, there are individual uses that you'll notice in the use table that are only allowed in some of the more intense districts too. With that, I'll hand it over to Andrew to cover our production districts.
All right, moving on to discuss production districts and production uses. In Minneapolis 2040, the plan lays out 2 future land use designations for production areas. The first is the production mixed use, which is intended to be a mixed use area that supports light industrial production type uses, along with a variety of commercial uses and residential uses in some situation. Oftentimes, adaptive reuse of older industrial buildings is part of the context in this district, and that's encouraged in this future land use district. The production mixed use future land use district is intended to allow for some of the widest range of uses of all of the future land use districts. And then second, we have the production and processing future land use designation. That's intended to be focused on employment and to reserve available land for production jobs and protect them from being displaced by other types of uses. It allows for a wide variety of light and medium industrial uses, as well as some limited commercial uses, while at the same time prohibiting most commercial uses, as well as all residential uses. Next slide. Minneapolis 2040 does have some action steps which relate to production areas, which have directly informed our draft recommendations here. One of those is to prioritize land in production areas for production uses and production types that have low negative offsite impacts and support living wage jobs. One is to limit production uses that are not job intensive. Another is to limit heavy industrial uses, those uses that have a high potential for pollution that harms human health or the environment. And another shown here is to limit self-storage uses to incorporation in active buildings with other uses. Next slide, please. And so we are recommending 2 production districts in the new code to implement the production land use guidance, the PR1 production mixed use district and the PR2 production and processing district. We're recommending that those districts be mapped to directly correspond to the production mixed use and production and processing future land use designations. On the map here, you can see the proposed PR1 district mapped in light purple and the PR2 district in the darker purple. The PR1 district, much like I just mentioned with the policy, supports light industrial type production uses, many commercial uses, as well as residential uses in some situations. For larger residential developments, we would require the incorporation of production uses. Right now, that threshold for requiring production space is proposed at 20 units. And this district is generally similar, not the same, but generally similar to today's I-1 district with the industrial living overlay district. And so with this rezoning study and the implementation of the PR1 district, the ILOD district can be eliminated from the zoning code. And then the PR2 district is proposed to correspond with the production and processing future land use designation. Like with the policy, that allows for a variety of light and medium industrial type production uses, as well as some commercial uses, and prohibits residential uses, and is somewhat similar in character to today's I-2 district. One big change here is that we are going from 3 industrial districts under the current code to 2 production districts under the new code. We are not proposing a new zoning district, which is similar in character or intent to the current I-3 district. With a few limited exceptions, the heavier industrial uses, which are intended to be accommodated and are accommodated by the current I-3 district, are proposed to be prohibited citywide in response to the adopted policy that we have to that end. Next slide, please. So the production use group is proposed to have 5 use categories. The first one is lower impact production and processing. These are production uses that generally have very little or no offsite impacts. They're proposed to be allowed in both PR1 and PR2, as well as in other districts like the commercial districts and the residential mixed use districts for certain specific uses like art studios or smaller breweries are examples of that. Next category here is moderate impact production and processing uses. These are uses which have some potential for offsite impacts, but are generally limited in those impacts. Those are proposed to be allowed in the PR2 district only. The next use category here is the high impact production and processing uses. These are production uses with a high potential for significant offsite impacts. And reflecting the adopted policy that we have, most uses in this category are proposed to be prohibited citywide. There are a few specific uses that fall into the high impact production and processing category, which are proposed to be conditionally permitted in the PR2 district, subject to specific use standards. The next category here is post-consumer waste processing. Those are uses related to waste sorting and transportation and disposal. Like the high impact production and processing category, those are generally proposed to be prohibited citywide. The 2 exceptions there are recycling centers and waste transfer facilities, which are proposed to be conditional in the PR2, subject to some specific standards. The last category here is warehousing and storage. Those uses are generally proposed to be permitted in PR1 and PR2 with some exceptions for some specific uses. And with that, I will turn it back over to Joe to talk about the downtown districts.
I think I've got the downtown districts. Thank you, Andrew. 3 downtown districts are proposed. As most would expect, these districts would allow a relatively wide range of uses with the intent of strengthening the downtown's position as a regional commercial, cultural, and entertainment center that serves residents, employees, and visitors. Next slide, please. The action steps for downtown include promoting the growth and retention of businesses and office space downtown, encouraging the recruitment and retention of retailers in downtown that help office workers and residents fulfill daily needs, continue to support a growing residential population downtown, and support downtown as a unique regional destination for tourism with activities during the day, evening, and weekends. Next slide, please. The downtown center district would be located in and around the core of downtown and would serve a range of uses that attract people from throughout the region. The downtown service district would be more on the edges of downtown and would allow some production uses, typically in areas of the fringe of downtown that have typically been more industrial in nature. And the distinguishing factor of the downtown destination district is that it would require ground floor commercial uses in a manner similar to the current standards that are applicable to Nicollet Mall, but would also be mapped along, in addition to Nicollet, Hennepin, First Avenue North, Washington, and Chicago, among some other places. Next slide, please. There are some zoning districts that are found outside of downtown that would also be mapped primarily, again, on the edges of downtown. The UN3 district would be applied in areas with urban neighborhood future land use guidance, such as a segment of the North Loop riverfront. The production mixed use would be applied in production mixed use, just like in other parts of the city. RM2 would be applied in areas with neighborhood office and services future land use guidance that is found in the Loring Park area. RM3 would be applied in areas of downtown that have residential zoning today and lower intensity built form districts. And then CM3 would be applied with the community mixed use future land use guidance found adjacent to Loring Park and along Glenwood Avenue. Next slide. I think I'm handing it over to Joe.
Yeah, so regarding the parks, future land use guidance, Minneapolis 2040 identifies existing and planned parkland, including some key trails, and places those properties into a future land use designation called parks and open space, which seems pretty straightforward. Furthermore, Minneapolis 2040 calls on us to continue to coordinate with the park board on these issues, and we're doing so, and to use park board planning documents as well as we consider parks related items in our work. Next slide, please. Of course, it can't be as simple as that. Today, we do not have a park-specific zoning district. Most parks in the city today are zoned with a low-density residential district. One issue that we have with that is that all of the fun stuff we love to see in our parks, like restaurants, for example, they're not allowed in residential districts. So we need to make a determination as staff about them being accessory to a park, and this can be confusing and cumbersome for both city staff, park board staff, and vendors. So to address this issue, we are proposing to create a primary park zoning district that will make it clear that parks related uses like those restaurants that we love to see in our parks are appropriate. We also have a situation where some private property is identified in Minneapolis 2040 as a future park, and that's consistent with park board plans. What we have to be careful of is we cannot limit the use of that private property to parks only. So we need to leave those property owners with a viable path to using their property in another manner until they can become a park. Next slide. So to address that issue about privately owned property with parks guidance, we're proposing a parks overlay district that property owners can request to have applied to their property that will allow additional uses to be established on those sites between now and a time when the future vision of those sites as parks can be accomplished. And we're intending to use the PUD process that we have in place to do that, to hopefully get us closer to a parks vision in the interim on those sites. Finally, the last primary zoning district you'll find in the draft materials is the transportation zoning district. It is not applied to very many properties and is applied mostly in unique situations where the land is already used for rail rights of way or rail yards or maybe sometimes leftover parcels near freeways. This district will have a very limited number of uses allowed in them. The purpose of that is that if these locations transition away from transportation uses in the future, we have the ability to have a larger conversation about what those places should look like and perhaps do that through a comprehensive plan amendment process. Next slide, please. Just a few slides left here before we open things up for questions. Want to cover some changes to other parts of the code here outside of our primary districts. So because of the changes proposed to our primary districts, we're able to make some changes to our existing overlays as well. You can see here that some of our overlay districts are becoming redundant. So for instance, we currently have a district called the Industrial Living Overlay District, which is something we've used to allow, it's the current mechanism for allowing residential uses in our I-1 industrial district. That can go away because the equivalent of I-1 moving forward is this PR1 district, and that district will allow residential anyway. So we don't need this overlay anymore. Similarly, the pedestrian-oriented overlay district is proposed for elimination because the regulations from that district are being moved to other parts of the code and being applied more broadly throughout the entire city. Some other issues to note, lot dimension requirements in the Shoreland Overlay District are changing slightly. This is in response to some state regulations that we need to comply with in shoreland areas that the DNR sets. And the last item here is that while built form districts are largely unchanged, there are some lot dimension and yard requirements that used to be in our primary zoning districts, and those are moving to the built form districts so that all of the built form stuff can be found in one place. I will hand it off to Jason and Janelle here to take us home.
Thank you, Joe. You can see here the proposed chapters. We are proposing to reorganize and consolidate some of the chapters within the zoning code. There would be 10 chapters plus the land subdivision regulations that will continue to address the platting and subdivision of property. 10 chapters, I think, is about half of the number of chapters that are currently in the code. The 2 chapters that are highlighted here are those that have the content that the public is probably going to be most interested in, that include the most of the standards applicable to land uses. A good deal of the content in the other chapters is being carried over from the current zoning code and reorganized in a hopefully more intuitive way. We, of course, welcome you to review and comment on all of the material, but if your time is somewhat limited, we'd recommend focusing initially on the Chapter 530, zoning districts, and Chapter 545, use regulations. Next slide. We talked a little bit about the use table earlier. The uses are listed by use group, use category, and then some specific uses. The table does not attempt to list every imaginable use. However, there are thorough lists of examples of uses shortly after the use table that indicate which type of uses fall within each category. Where you see a P listed on the table, that means that that use category or specific use would be permitted in that zoning district. Where you see a C, that means the use requires a conditional use permit, which includes a public hearing in front of the Planning Commission. An asterisk means that the use would only be allowed as part of a residential mixed-use building. The intent there is that the RM1 district in particular is primarily residential in nature and will allow some small scale commercial uses, but not standalone retail uses. Where you see a number, that's a proxy for the maximum size of that individual use. For example, 5P under a use would be a permitted use that's limited to 5,000 square feet of floor area. In the comprehensive plan, there is some guidance about where smaller scale versus larger scale uses ought to be allowed. And then in the final column, an X means that there are additional standards applicable to that use above and beyond general zoning standards. Next slide. This is a better look at how the table is formatted. I'll just note that each use category shows which districts that category of uses are allowed in. Some specific uses are listed in the table for one of 2 reasons. One reason is that the specific use is allowed in different districts compared to the category that it's in, because that individual use has a different impact than the other uses in the same category. As an example, you can see which districts commercial recreation and assembly would be allowed in. But then if you look at a convention center, that's typically a pretty large use and would only be allowed in the 3 downtown districts and not all of the other districts where commercial recreation and assembly are allowed. The other reason that a specific use is listed on the table is if it has one of those use standards at the far right hand side of the table. I think I'm passing it on to Janelle.
Thanks, Jason. We just wanted to show some examples of the use category descriptions that were mentioned. So each use category has a description that's located in the same chapter as the use table. And that description includes some common characteristics for that use category, as well as a list of examples to help further explain what's intended to be captured by that use category. And we try to list out as many uses as possible to give as examples, but the lists are not exhaustive, excuse me. And then in some cases, we also list exceptions. So uses that seem like they might fit within a use category, but are actually either included with a different use category or are maybe just prohibited outright in the code. Next slide, please. And we also wanted to share an example of the use standards. So there are two types of use standards. First, there are just general use standards that apply to a whole use category, and as well as specific use standards. So this example shown here is for just general use standards. So they would apply to all uses that fall within this specific use category. And as Jason mentioned, the use standard column on the far right of the table includes an X for those use categories that have these general standards. Next slide, please. And then here's an example of more specific use standards where a specific use is called out, and then these specific standards that apply to that use are identified within that section. And again, the use standard column in the table is indicating whether or not these specific use standards would apply to a specific use or not. Next slide, please. And then just one more thing to note as you're looking at the use table or whenever uses are mentioned in the code, almost all of the uses that we mention or identify in the zoning code have a definition that can be found in the definitions chapter at the end of the code. So if you're wondering, what do they mean by this specific type of use, or what's the difference between a market garden and an urban farm, for example, you can look up those uses in the definitions chapter to get a little more clarification. So with that, I'm going to be turning it back to Jason.
Thank you, Janelle. That actually concludes the slides that we have for this meeting. I think we will have our staff go to the chat, to the Q&A to look at some of the questions that we have not responded to in writing and pose some of those questions to us.
Thanks very much, Jason. The first question is for Joe. The question is, so far you haven't mentioned the 2 designated green zones. How is the 2040 zoning protecting those green zones from further environmental harms?
Great, thanks for that question. I'm going to go back to our Minneapolis 2040 public engagement process and just share that at that time, when we were developing Minneapolis 2040, I was working as staff both on that plan, and I was also a CPED representative on the Southside Green Zones. And it happened to work out really well that a lot of the recommendations coming out of the Southside Green Zone were things that we could consider and incorporate into Minneapolis 2040. So you heard, I think the thing I would point to is you heard in Andrew's remarks about the production districts that prohibiting the worst polluters from establishing new uses in the city. That comes straight out of the green zone recommendations, as well as some of the use standards that we've developed for uses in our production districts are intended to address the harms that can come from some of those more troublesome industries. And of course, part of the reason for having this public engagement process and the public review period is that we definitely want folks to take a close look at those uses that are allowed in those locations and give us feedback on what we might be missing, especially as it relates to environmental justice.
Thank you, Joe. The next question is for you as well. And the question is, can you explain the park zone again for private property? How does that work, and what would property owners be allowed to do?
So the example that I'll point to and that we're working on is that the majority of where we have this situation where we have privately owned property with future parkland designation from the comp plan is on the upper riverfront. And that vision for parks along the riverfront that the city shares with the park board is very long-term vision. And so in that interim period between now and whenever the park board and the city have the financial wherewithal to acquire property for parks, we're going to initially limit the activity that can happen on that private property, but then give those private property owners a process they can go through to establish additional uses. The way we're doing that is with an overlay district. And what will happen is that, or as we're proposing it to happen, is that those property owners will apply for a conditional use permit to establish a planned unit development. And there will be a list of uses that are appropriate to establish in those locations. As part of a planned unit development, you have to provide amenities to qualify for the planned unit development. And so it will offer staff and appointed and elected officials and applicants the opportunity to get us closer to a park-like condition in the interim through that amenity process. But the key thing here is that the city cannot prohibit all development on privately owned property without putting ourselves in a position to have to compensate those property owners with financially. So that's where we're at right now, and I would anticipate you look for some of these details and some of these details on the, especially in the parks. Guidance might change a little bit between now and when it goes to the Planning Commission.
Thanks very much, Joe. The next question is for Jason. The question reads, RM districts seem to only allow commercial development in large mixed-use buildings. Why not any standalone uses? The Minneapolis 2040 guidance doesn't seem to want to prohibit commercial activity in small-scale buildings.
Sure. So the RM1 district is a district that runs through urban neighborhood future land use, but it has what's called a goods and services corridor designated on the street. The intent of the district is to be primarily a residential district, but to also serve the purpose of expanding the range of goods and services that are available to those neighborhoods. So we think the intent of that district is not to allow for tearing down of residential homes, for example, to build a standalone retail building. When a retail use is proposed, we're suggesting that that be relatively small in scale and that it only be part of a building that also has residential uses incorporated, typically on the upper floors.
I'll just probably add, we have quite a few questions that were coming up about how to interact with the proposed text, and then also where to access the maps. And I just want to point people to the answers in the Q&A as well. But maybe if we want to just again highlight where in 2040 on the website, the information that can be provided to the general public, and then also where people can make comments.
Joe, would you like to answer that one?
Sure. So remind me, I was responding in text to another question. We're talking about the maps and how to submit comments, right?
That's and the proposed text. Thanks, Joe.
Yeah. So the map comes in a couple of different formats. You can go to the project website and find it in a handout that is in PDF format. And you can zoom in on that pretty close, but you can't really necessarily tell on what individual parcel you might have a specific zoning district. So really encourage folks to try and use the interactive map that's there, where you can zoom in or search for a specific address to find the property you're interested in. If you have comments about the map, or maybe you find an error, please use there's a comment form on the project website as well, and just note that the comments about the map, and give us an address, and we'll take a close look at it. And then generally speaking, there's a few ways to submit feedback generally about the work. One is that there's a survey that I know a number of people here tonight have already filled out. Thank you for doing so. I think there's been there's like 120 responses or so to that so far. And we continue to get emails from folks sent to 2040@minneapolismn.gov. Again, there's a link to that email on the project website. And I already mentioned there's a form that you can just fill out right on the project website as well. So a number of different ways to submit feedback.
I have a question for the group. Can you talk about where and when pedestrian requirements, design requirements are used in the pedestrian overlay code, and where they'll end up instead? So I think a little bit back to what happened to the pedestrian oriented overlay. I think, Joe, that you covered that. And will this be worked into built form, land use, or somewhere else?
So I can start by just offering what is changing in terms of how we're dealing with the use elements of the pedestrian-oriented overlay district. The design requirements, I'll have to ask someone else to jump in. But our pedestrian-oriented overlay district today limits, for example, where you can have auto-oriented uses. So most of our PO districts prohibit auto-oriented uses like gas stations, auto repair, things like that. Since we have guidance from Minneapolis 2040 about which commercial districts should allow those uses moving forward, it takes that responsibility away from our overlay districts, and we put it right in the primary zoning districts. So I think the only commercial district where you'll be able to establish a auto repair shop would be in the community mixed use district, and there are a host of requirements related to lot size and whatnot that I think I'll ask either Jason or Janelle to step in and cover for me.
Sure. Automobile services uses would be required to provide at least 14,000 square feet of lot area. And the idea there is to allow, to ensure that those properties have sufficient maneuvering of vehicles, and if there are vehicles waiting to be repaired, for example, that there is room to accommodate those on the site rather than on the street. There's also a standard that currently applies to, I think it's just the pedestrian-oriented overlay district along Nicollet Avenue, up the East Street area, where there's a prohibition on the garage doors for vehicle repair to face the street. We would incorporate that as a general standard. Again, to ensure a more pedestrian orientation, even in those districts where automobile services would be allowed. I'll just note also that our site plan review standards, which are not undergoing significant change as part of this process, are also the city's primary tool for ensuring that buildings are constructed, commercial buildings are constructed near the street, that they have a front entrance, that they have generous amount of window area, that we minimize curb cuts, and those types of standards that ensure pedestrian safety and pedestrian orientation.
We have a specific use question that will have Andrew address, and that is, what is concrete crushing and why would we want that in the city?
Sure. So with the 2040 guidance that we have, the specific action step on identifying and prohibiting uses with the greatest potential for pollution and offsite impacts, we do recognize that there are some uses that can have significant offsite impacts, which there are reasons to still allow in the city due to their necessity or the services that they provide. So there are a variety of uses like that. One of those, for example, is a waste transfer facility. I think it is apparent that a waste transfer facility is the type of use that can have that often has significant offsite impacts, but it is necessary to have a place for garbage and recycling trucks to go to within the city rather than having every single garbage truck leave the city. A concrete crushing facility is another use that we currently have on that list to allow for processing of concrete and other materials that are removed in the city during construction projects, road rebuilding, and that sort of thing to happen at least partially within the city rather than always having to be brought immediately outside of the city. Concrete crushing is a use that we have talked about internally whether or not that does belong on that list, and those list of that list of higher impact production and processing uses, which we are recommending to still allow under very specific circumstances in the city, is an open question, and it is an area where we definitely welcome feedback. So if you have specific feedback on any of those higher impact production uses, or the recycling center or waste transfer facility, on any of those uses, those specific uses, including concrete crushing, please do send that to us. That's something that we are definitely welcoming feedback on. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrew. The next question is for Jason. And the question reads, with the prohibited types, are those things that will be removed, or is it only that new ones of those types will not be built? The note on gas stations was particularly interesting. Curious about that in particular, but also if pre-existing industrial companies will be moving out of neighborhoods.
Sure, that's a good question. The note about gas stations, Minneapolis 2040, is pretty specific about not allowing new gas stations. Our approach with gas stations specifically is that they are conditional in some districts only when existing on the effective date of the ordinance. The strategy there is to not make every single one non-conforming. That is a policy choice. People can comment on whether that's the appropriate approach. The idea to not associated with not making every single one of them non-conforming is that it requires quite a bit of process, both for staff and the Planning Commission and those property owners every time they want to make a small change. For example, if a gas station would want to enlarge its canopy over the gas pumps, for example, if we make it non-conforming, they would be going to the Planning Commission every time they wanted to do a minor change like that. But new gas stations would not be able to be established in any zoning district. Now, for those uses that we will be making non-conforming, such as the heaviest intensity industrial uses that are currently first allowed in the I3 district, for example, under state law, we are required to allow non-conforming uses to continue to exist as long as they continue to function. If that use, a non-conforming use, becomes vacant for a period of a year or more, after that point, the uses that can be established on that property are only those uses that are allowed in that zoning district. Someone can make a try to rebut that the property was abandoned and say that there was some kind of extraordinary circumstances. If they do that, they have to make that case typically through what's called a non-conforming use certificate in front of the Board of Adjustment. But again, properties that we're making non-conforming, we are not able to make them just go away and move out of the city. They do have non-conforming rights under state law.
I do want to address, we're getting a few comments here about why are we moderating questions and why aren't we just publishing all of the questions at once. And we just want to make clear that we're seeing all of your questions. They are all going to be published on the project website, even if we don't get to them in the next few minutes here. And part of the reason why we're not jumping in and addressing some of these questions right away is that the answers are a little more complicated than we can answer on the fly and in real time. And so we want to give some real time and thought to them before we respond to some of them. But there will be a response. We're gonna publish all of them and respond to all of them and post them on the project website. So thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Joe. We do have another question that that we can answer pretty easily. When is the deadline to provide comments on the land use rezoning study?
So the official public review period is going to end on March 26th, and that will give staff some time to take the comments that we've received. It ensures that we have some time to try and incorporate feedback that we've gotten before we finalize the work and finalize a staff recommendation that is sent to the Planning Commission and then the City Council. However, if you can't make that March 26th deadline, we will still take all of the comments that we receive and package them and present them to the Planning Commission and the City Council for their consideration. It's just that deadline makes it easier for us as staff to consider and incorporate changes before we bring them to the public hearing.
Thanks very much, Joe. The next question is for Janelle. Are community gardens, market gardens, and urban farms impacted by these changes? And are there any other food systems related changes, such as commercial kitchens, food trucks, grocery stores, and farmers market, etc.?
Those urban agricultural uses, for the most part, the regulations aren't changing substantially. There are some additional considerations for community gardens, for example, that pertain to some year-round structures. So there's a little more flexibility being incorporated there. Let's see, this is a long question. Some of the other things, we're generally just allowing or increasing the amount of commercial area by about 50%. So that is opening more opportunities to have more access to food. And it related to food trucks, there's certain regulations about that. Those are not, since they're not in a building, they are considered to be unenclosed. So there is under consideration allowing food trucks to be located at certain locations that have now more commonly had food trucks located at them. So some additional considerations are being looked at there.
I think that we have a couple general questions about some of the regulatory tools that maybe we currently have in place or will continue going forward to kind of ensure protection from offsite impacts from maybe adjacent commercial or residential. We asked one of the presenters to just kind of talk about how some of the existing regulations and land use separation kind of address that.
Sorry, could you quick rephrase or repeat that question?
Sure, I'll ask one of them specifically. So say more about how you will use regulatory tools to minimize the impacts that commercial uses have on residential areas is one of the questions, for example.
So two main things. One is limiting the size of the commercial use that can be established in certain districts. That's one tool that's being incorporated. So that's certainly an area where feedback can be considered, about the scale of certain commercial uses. If, at a certain point, certainly some uses definitely have more impact on adjacent residential areas than others. So if there are certain uses that are of concern, that's one way we could look at it. Another way that we've looked at addressing impacts on adjacent properties is those specific use standards, again, related to specific uses or just general use categories in general. So again, those are certainly things where we can take into consideration if there's certain concerns about certain types of uses. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything else related to that.
I'll just add that for new construction, again, there are site plan review standards that include landscaping and screening requirements. There are setback requirements, and of course, there are other city ordinances outside the zoning code that deal with stormwater management, lighting impacts, light and glare, noise impacts, et cetera, that are and will continue to be in other parts of the city's code of ordinances.
Here's a question regarding electric charging stations. Will the proposed regulations require gas stations to install fast electric charging stations with any time a new use of a property comes up as a gas station?
I can respond to that. So within the past couple of years, the city has developed electric vehicle charging incentives, and in new surface parking lots, there will be there are electric vehicle charging requirements now for surface parking lots over a certain size. I will note that this cities in Minnesota are limited in their ability to require electric vehicle charging because that is interpreted to be a standard that can, if we have a requirement, it goes up beyond what is required by the building code, and therefore the state building official interprets that to be a standard that differs from the building systems requirements of the state building code. You asked specifically about gas stations. I could see us justifying a standard that if a gas station wants to add pumps, for example, gasoline pumps, that for every pump that's added, an EV charging station has to be incorporated on the property. I think we could legally justify a requirement like that when somebody is asking for an expansion of a use that's not allowed to be newly established.
Thank you, Jason. Here's another question regarding the park-specific designation. So we'll turn this over to Joe. Regarding the new park-specific designation, restaurants were mentioned specifically, but also vendors. Would something like bike rentals be allowed? And then also maybe there's a question regarding restaurants versus something more like a fast food restaurant.
Yeah, so the bike rentals is a good example of something that we want to allow the park board to be able to just establish in parks, and something that we don't need to have a lot of regulations around. So that's something that we'll call out specifically as an accessory use to a park, and it's just something that will be allowed. As far as giving preference to individuals over corporations, that's not something that we're considering and in this ordinance, and particularly not in the parks districts. That's certainly something that the parks, the park board as the owner of those properties and the tenant to those vendors could certainly consider, but not something that's in the purview of our work.
Thank you, Joe. The next question is for Jason, and just kind of generally, were similarly sized cities considered while looking at rezoning proposals, or something that we call internally peer city research? So can you talk a little bit about how we looked at other ordinances when considering the proposed land use rezoning study text amendment?
Sure, good question. Of course, we are implementing policies that are unique to Minneapolis, so we're not implementing the policies from our peer cities, but in the development of our standards, we have looked at ordinances from peer cities and have spoken with planners from peer cities and have done quite a bit of work to understand what the best practices are for structuring a code to make it more user-friendly. Just as an example, the use table that we're proposing, the approach to not list every single imaginable use on the use table. We have heard from planners in one peer city of a similar size that is the best aspect of their zoning code, that allows a new use, for example, that isn't listed. It wouldn't typically be listed in a use table. You're able to look at the characteristics of that use category and decide whether that use fits within that district. However, we have in the examples of each use category tried to list as many uses as possible in order to avoid unnecessary amount of interpretation as well. So there's a balancing act there. But so the short answer is yes, we have done quite a bit of research into peer city zoning codes.
Thanks very much, Jason. Maybe we'll leave this question with you as well. What is the best way for the public to provide comments? Is it through feedback form at the project website, via email, or can someone mail in their feedback regarding the land use rezoning study?
Sure. I think whatever you're most comfortable with. The website provides a few different options, either responding to a survey, providing your own kind of free form comments, or emailing us at 2040@minneapolismn.gov. We're happy to take feedback through any of those channels. We don't get a lot of feedback through the US mail, but we'll take it if that's how you choose to send it to us.
Thanks very much, Jason. As Joe mentioned earlier, we have quite a few more questions that we have to answer that we would like to spend quality time being able to provide thoughtful responses, and that information will be posted on 2040. So I'm going to send it back over to Jason to close it up. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Shanna, and thanks to the other presenters. I think we hope this has been really informative. This is a complicated topic. We understand that. We are trying to make the zoning code as intuitive and user-friendly as possible. Ultimately, however, it is a legal document that, it's an ordinance that has to stand up in court and that has to address a lot of different situations in a city of 400,000 people. We're not expecting everyone to become experts on the zoning code, but we are here to help people understand this to the extent that's possible without having years of training and experience dealing with zoning codes. With that, we look forward to receiving comments. The document will evolve before the final staff recommendation is posted prior to the City Planning Commission. We're trying to be responsive to comments and as they come in, and provide updates that align with the policies of Minneapolis 2040. With that, thank you for spending time with us, and thank you for engaging. Have a good night.